I'm Meg Thornbury, and I am so happy to be here this morning talking to you about mental health, because mental health awareness and advocacy is my passion. And that's partially because I have a mental illness, specifically bipolar, and even more specifically, I have rapid cycling cyclothymic bipolar. So I'll break that down for you. The rapid cycling means that when it was bad for me, I would go from being depressed to euphoric to anxious to irritable within a day, which was exhausting. And the cyclothymic part means that it has been mild but chronic. So I've never been hospitalized, and I've never had a full-blown manic episode, but I did go through a period where for 2 years, I was not stable for more than a month or two, which is also exhausting. So my bipolar started in high school, but didn't get bad until college. My junior year, I started to see a therapist, and by halfway through senior year, I was seeing 2 therapists and a psychiatrist. I was diagnosed as anxious and depressed, and given 4 or 5 different antidepressants to try. And a fun fact, if you have bipolar and you take antidepressants, they don't help. They go even worse. So instead of having your regular ups and downs, you no longer have downs. You just go up and up and up. So I managed to graduate, and then we were like, oh, I'm done with college. I'm done with the stress. I'm going to get better. But I didn't. I got worse. And it got so bad that I was having daily panic attacks. I was heavily self-medicating with alcohol and weed, and I was absolutely miserable. And I actually lost my job because I was late to work. And I was late to work because I was having a panic attack about being late to work and losing my job. So on one hand, it was the most justified panic attack I've ever had. And on the other hand, I lost my job because of mental illness. So I moved back home, moved back in, and actually saw a therapist that Daphne recommended. And after talking with this therapist, she looked at me and she said, "Is this how you presented to your last psychiatrist?" And I was like, "Yes." And she said, "I think you have bipolar." And so she recommended a fantastic psychiatrist who I went to, and he confirmed that yes, I did in fact have bipolar. And he got me sober, on a strict sleep schedule, and on the right meds, and I'm happy to say that I have been stable for over a year now. It feels so much better. So having this journey has given me a really unique perspective on mental illness. And as a sociology major, I have constantly viewed this through a lens of social dynamics and structures and privilege. And being high functioning is such a privilege, which I didn't realize until I lost that privilege. The other thing that I really noticed is that our society is kind of terrible at treating mental illness like any other illness. For example, with someone who has diabetes, if they were having a blood sugar high or low, which does change your behavior, we wouldn't ask them, "Well, have you just tried harder to produce insulin? Like, what if you just took a bath before bed?" We would never do that. We would ask if they needed juice or water or whatever they needed to get their blood sugar levels balanced again. So for me, finding balance means taking Lamictal twice a day to keep my brain activity levels balanced. And I was able to come to this place of healing a lot because of this church. I have been coming to this church since I was 3 years old. So this is truly my second home and my church community. And this is the place where I learned that God has unconditional love for each and every single one of us, no matter what and no matter where we are. And so if God created all of us in their image and doesn't make mistakes, that meant that I wasn't a mistake. It meant that this wasn't my fault that I had mental illness. It was genetics. And that there's nothing wrong with me, there's just something wrong with my brain. And having that moment is so helpful and so healing. And I really attribute that to this place. So don't forget about the capital campaign. from Duke University that just came out that said that people who are actively involved in religious organizations and communities on average live 7 years longer than people without faith communities. And I find that to be incredibly important in juxtaposition with the statistic that people with mental illness on average have shorter lifespans than people without mental illness. So to me, that means that it is incredibly important for us as a religious community to carve out a space for mental illness, because we have the opportunity to not just save lives, but to extend them. And putting this in a religious context, all of our readings today actually talk about mental illness. In Psalms, we're taken on this beautiful journey across the world, hearing about all of the different places that are praising God. And the ones that jump out to me are the deepest depths of the ocean, complete with sea monsters, and all of these crazy extreme weathers. To me, that means that God is there with us through the deepest depths of depression, through the sea monsters of anxiety, and through all of the crazy storms that mental illness throws our way. In Revelations, I find it really interesting that only in heaven or at the end of the world do pain and suffering and crying end. It's only in those places where those are no more. And so I think that means that crying and suffering are very intensely human, and that people with mental illness are just very, very human. And now in Acts, Peter goes out and, goes out to the unclean, and we're going to hear a lot about that theme, but I think Peter did exactly what Jesus would do, so go Peter. And he has this vision where he clearly hears the voice of God say, "Do not call that which I have made clean, unclean." And God, remember, doesn't make mistakes. And so mental illness isn't a mistake, and it isn't unclean. It's just something that happens, and it doesn't need to be kept at arm's length. It's something that is totally fine to bring into religious communities and into our lives and outwards love into the world. And also, as a little sidebar, I wonder what would happen today if Peter was here sharing his vision. If Peter was out on a street corner and was loudly proclaiming how he had had this vision where this giant sheet came out of the sky and he heard this voice and it told him what to do, I'm pretty sure we'd call the cops on Peter. So I just find that interesting that, these things that are once so sacred and actually are found sacred in other cultures around the world, we have made them so profane as a society. And I think that there is something to that. And then last but not least, we have the gospel, where Jesus gives the last and most important commandment to love one another as Jesus loves us. And that we will be known as Christians by the love that we share for one another. And mental illness needs a whole lot of love. I love how we talk about Jesus' work in Godly Play, where we say that Jesus came to come close to people, especially those that no one else wanted to come close to. And there's a lot of people who don't want to come close to mental illness. But I would argue that it is not just our Christian duty, but it is our Christian identity to come close to these people and to show love for mental illness. Amen.